Hello there, and welcome back to the next episode of the House Detective Diaries. This week I'm going to be talking about the history of the Centenary suburbs, a great building at Spring Hill. Then I'm going to tell you a little bit about another house I researched at Spring Hill and how it got its name. I'm going to tell you a little bit about these great resources that I use for researching the history of houses. And finally, I'm going to be talking about a house at Tarragindi in Brisbane and how I figured out that it must have been relocated to the site. First up, the Centenary suburbs. So I was driving over the Centenary Bridge across the Brisbane River the other day, and it got me thinking, they're currently duplicating it, and it got me thinking about how that bridge was now over 60 years old and how much more traffic was flowing through that area compared to when it was first built. And it's amazing that it's only just being duplicated now. So the Centenary Bridge was built as part of the Centenary Estates development. And this began with a director from the real estate company LJ Hooker. Leslie Joseph Hooker was the man who started this business. And I've actually discussed him in a previous video. I'll put a link here. And he was flying over this area, which was largely farming and dairy cattle grazing country. And he basically saw the dollar signs. They decided that they were going to transform this farmland area on the outskirts of Brisbane into Queensland's first master planned community. Now, this is a concept that we are really familiar with these days. So you'll have a new suburb such as Springfield Lakes, for example, where it includes residential development, schools, churches, shops and businesses, industrial areas and parks and that type of thing, all in the one community. But at the time that the Centenary Estates were being developed, this was a revolutionary concept in Queensland. And along with the revolutionary idea of this, basically building an entire village from scratch, was the marketing materials that they used to promote it as well. So this is the first time that you really see that effort to sell the lifestyle of a residential area. So the brochures are amazing. They're glossy coloured brochures. They feature all these slick, modern, attractive couples living the high life in their new suburbs. Now, you might wonder why they're actually called the Centenary suburbs. Well, on that fateful day when the director of LJ Hooker took a flight over the area, it was 1959, and that's when they decided to progress with this development. And 1959 was 100 years since Queensland was declared a separate colony from New South Wales. So 100-year anniversary, the Centenary, the name Centenary Estates. The area where they were going to build this master plan community was known as Jindalee or 17 Mile Rocks at the time. However, the new estate development was going to would eventually incorporate the suburbs of, now there's 7 suburbs, let's see if I can remember them. Jindalee, Mount Ommaney, River Hills, Westlake, Jamboree Heights, no, I can't remember, Sumner Park and Middle Park. There you go. I knew I would remember those. So it's a massive area, and the different suburbs were developed at different times gradually. When I was growing up, when I was in high school, I was living in an old timber and tin house in Corinda. A lot of my friends came from these new relatively new Centenary suburbs, and I thought they were so rich. They had, instead of these daggy old falling apart old timber and tin houses, they had beautiful modern brick homes. Oh my gosh, some were even 2-story, which was unheard of at the time in my little bubble of a world. And many of them had pools. So there you go. That's a rough, in a nutshell, history of the Centenary suburbs. And now you know where they get the name from, and you can bore all your friends at dinner parties. You're welcome. The Spring Hill twinsies. I was lurking around the streets in Spring Hill the other day having a look at some of the gorgeous old buildings because I'm researching a house at Spring Hill at the moment. And one of the streets I walked down was Gloucester Street, and this street's quite remarkable. It's a very, very early street in Brisbane. Somewhere around the 1850s it was first developed, and when you think about the fact that Brisbane was only open to free settlers in 1842, then you're talking only 10 years of development of this new town. They're twin buildings. They were identical when they were constructed, and I just found them absolutely fascinating because it's not a style that you see in Brisbane very often. So a lot of the southern states have their 2-story terrace buildings that are built right side by side of each other, but we don't really have a lot lot of those in Brisbane. So these are just really interesting examples of the timber and tin version of terrace housing. The buildings were built for John Wall in about 1882, and when I was walking past them, one of the most striking features, well, I don't know if everyone would notice this, but I'm a massive building nerd, so of course this is what I first noticed, is the width of the timber boards on these houses. They are monstrous. They're probably close to a foot wide, so around 30 centimeters or so. They are massive, and that's something that immediately tells you that these were quite early built buildings in Brisbane. Opposite these gorgeous buildings is a genuine duplex with a dividing party wall down the middle and mirror image residences on either side. This one's called Elton, and it was built in about 1909. And next door to Elton is also a pair of fabulous stone cottages, which are also very early in the street and absolutely gorgeous. And it's just, to me, it's just remarkable that these buildings have survived. Number 3, a beautiful historic house at Spring Hill called Lockharlton. Now, I researched this quite a few years ago now. The house was originally built for Thomas Illich, who was a very successful boot and shoe manufacturer in Brisbane and had a store on Queen Street in the CBD. Started construction around 1884, but it was definitely completed by 1885. It was designed by Brisbane architect George William Campbell Wilson. He was a very well-known Brisbane architect. Illich christened his new home Woolarena. However, in 1926, it was purchased by Carl Brunick, and he renamed it Lockharlton. And I was very curious, and so were the clients at the time, where this name had come from. So I looked into Carl's history a little bit more, and it turns out his name was Lois. So what they had done is combine the first 2 letters of her name with Carl and then added ton on the end. So Lois and Carl became Lockharlton. And there you go. That's how I found the source of the name. Okay, one of my favorite research resources. So whenever I am researching a house, one of the things that are always my go-to sources of information are what are called detail plans. These detail plans are basically maps that were compiled prior to connecting Brisbane to sewerage. So the Brisbane City Council sent out surveyors to every single property in Brisbane, and they measured and mapped the houses, the outbuildings, the gardens, the boundaries of every single property in Brisbane over quite a long period of time. Now, why these detail plans are useful is because they show the footprint of any particular house at a particular time, and the dates do vary depending on when each area was sewered. But even better than these detail plan resources are the original surveyors' notebooks that were used to compile them. So most of these survive at the Brisbane City Council archives, and they are literally the surveyors' notebooks that they took out to site, wrote their measurements on, drew the outlines of the houses, all that type of stuff. They've got all this information on, and they often contain a lot more information than the final published detail plans. So it's always worth going back to have a look at them, because sometimes they have the owner's name on them, the house name on them. They'll show, they show what they were made out of, whether they were timber or stone. And there's often a lot more information recorded by hand by the surveyor than were ever published, as I mentioned. The other fantastic reason that I use these for is that it took so long to sewer Brisbane that often the surveyors had to go back in 5, 10, 15, sometimes 20 or 30 years and resurvey the houses and buildings. So what you get sometimes is a record of revisions that show the changes to any property over that time period. What's been removed, what's been extended, what's been demolished, what extra buildings have been added, has the dunny moved locations in the backyard. And you also sometimes capture the time period where an allotment went from a vacant lot to having a house on it and what that house looked like. So they're an absolutely invaluable resource when you're researching a house or building in Brisbane, and I use them all the time. And let's just face it, it's so cool to go into the archives and you get handed these old books and you can flip them open and have a look through, and you think about the poor person who has stood there in the Brisbane sunshine having to draw all these things out by hand, and they had no idea how much this little history nerd was going to value their work in the future. The last thing I'm going to talk to you about today is a house at Tarragindi that I researched quite a number of years ago, but the clients only just got in touch to order a copy of the hardcover books that I make up to put my histories in. And so I was back rereading through the research that I had done, and it was quite an interesting house because it was a really old design known as a colonial gable cottage. So these were very, very early styles, very simple styles of building in Brisbane, and they date anywhere from 1840s, 1850s, all the way up until the 1900s. So it's a very old style house, but it's in an area of Tarragindi that was definitely not developed until well after the 1900s. So it was a little bit of a curious one to start with. And after looking at all the different resources that I used to research homes, I discovered that there was actually no record of anyone living there until 1928. So this to me indicated that the house had likely been relocated to that site in probably the 1920s. Now, the frustrating thing about relocated houses, which is a really common thing to do in Queensland because our timber houses easily lend themselves to being moved, the frustrating thing from a research point of view is that the basis of my house history research is tied to the land that the house was built on. So that gives me all the information about who built it, when it was built, and it provides the sort of context for the house's construction as well. So when you relocate a house to another block, another suburb, and you don't know where it's come from, you really are disconnected from that early history. And to be honest, you can't find much out about it normally unless you know exactly where it was moved from. Unfortunately, early records are not great and they hardly ever recorded where a house was shifted from. And conversely, if you look at the block where a house was moved from, it never says where the house went to, if that makes sense. So you basically lose that connection with its original location, which means you lose the connection with the original history. You also lose the context of the house. So this house, for example, to me was probably built in the inner city somewhere, Spring Hill, the Valley, Kangaroo Point, somewhere like that in the early days. But by taking it out of that location and putting it in Tarragindi, it just doesn't really make sense anymore. Don't get me wrong, it's a beautiful house and sometimes relocation is all you can do to save these homes. But to me, it is much better to keep the house in its original location because it helps tell the story of the street and the suburb, not just the house. So that's my little rant about relocated houses. Well, that was the top 5 for this fortnight. I hope you enjoyed learning a little bit more about Brisbane history and some of the tricks and tips of researching houses that I use. And I'll see you next time.